It was January 1945, and a ship designed for leisure was packed with over 1,400 soldiers and thousands more fleeing civilians as Germany's Eastern Front collapsed. Ordered to sea with no manifest, too few lifeboats, and frozen escape routes, the Wilhelm Gustloff was driven by urgency, not safety. When disaster struck in sight of land, almost none survived. Why did these soldiers drown so close to safety, and how did a life-or-death evacuation spiral into the deadliest maritime disaster in history? The answer begins with the choices made long before that final night. By January 1945, the eastern provinces of Germany were collapsing under the weight of the Soviet advance. In the final days of the month, the Red Army swept through East Prussia, overrunning towns and villages that only weeks earlier had seemed distant from the front. The East Prussian offensive, launched on January 13th, quickly shattered German lines. Soviet forces reached the Baltic coast within 2 weeks, trapping entire communities between the advancing front and the freezing sea. Roads leading west clogged with columns of refugees, families on foot, horse-drawn carts, and overloaded wagons, moving slowly through snow and ice. The ports of Pillau, Gotenhafen, and Danzig became choke points. Tens of thousands gathered at the water's edge, hoping for passage to safety. Many had already endured days of bombing and artillery fire. Others arrived with little more than what they could carry, the rest abandoned along frozen roads or lost in the chaos. Civilian authorities and military units struggled to maintain order as more people pressed toward the docks. The air was filled with rumors of evacuation ships, but space was scarce and the situation grew more desperate with each hour. Reports from the time describe scenes of panic and confusion, mothers searching for missing children, wounded soldiers carried on makeshift stretchers, and elderly men and women unable to keep up with the crowds. The temperature hovered well below freezing, and those unable to board a ship faced grim odds of survival. On January 23rd, Grand Admiral Karl Dienitz issued the order for Operation Hannibal, a massive, urgent evacuation by sea. The goal was simple: move as many people as possible out of the Baltic corridor before Soviet units could cut off the ports entirely. Hundreds of vessels were pressed into service, from luxury liners and freighters to fishing boats and tugs. There was no time for thorough checks, no time for careful manifests or routine safety measures. Every available ship was loaded far beyond its intended capacity. The pressure on commanders and port officials was immense. Each delay meant more refugees left behind. Each hour increased the risk of Soviet artillery reaching the docks. In the last days of January, the port at Gotenhafen became a scene of mounting chaos. People crowded the gangways, pleading for passage. Naval officers and local officials tried to enforce boarding priorities for wounded soldiers, women, and children, but as news of the Soviet advance spread, control slipped away. The only certainty was that the window for escape was closing fast. The urgency driving the evacuation set the conditions for everything that followed. In this environment, where speed mattered above all else, decisions were made that would have lasting consequences. The Wilhelm Gustloff, a ship once built for leisure, was now at the center of a crisis defined by haste, uncertainty, and the relentless pressure of war. Operation Hannibal began with a single overriding directive: move as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, out of the Baltic corridor. Naval Command in the Baltic, under Grand Admiral Donitz, issued standing orders to prioritize throughput above all else. By the end of January 1945, hundreds of vessels, liners, freighters, fishing boats, and tugs were mobilized under this mandate. Every available ship was pressed into service, regardless of age, condition, or original purpose. The focus was on how many could be loaded, how fast they could be moved, and how little time could be spent in port. Manifests and passenger lists, standard for peacetime voyages, became an afterthought. Official instructions allowed or encouraged commanders to waive normal verification procedures. Port authorities and naval officers were told to keep ships moving, not to delay for paperwork or inspections. The sheer number of refugees arriving at the docks made any attempt at systematic registration nearly impossible. In Gotenhafen, Danzig, and Pillau, boarding was reduced to a matter of minutes for each vessel. Once a ship reached what was deemed a safe limit, or more often exceeded it, gangways were pulled and lines cast off. The next ship would then be rushed into position. The doctrine extended to the types of vessels used. Ships that had spent years as barracks, hospital ships, or pleasure cruisers were now loaded with thousands of civilians and military personnel. Many had not undergone full safety checks or maintenance. The pressure on port officials was relentless. Each hour spent tied up risked artillery fire or air attack. Each delay meant another crowd of refugees left behind on the freezing quay. Commanders faced a simple calculation. The more people they could embark, the more lives they might save from the advancing front. But the system left no time for careful matching of ship capacity to actual load, no time for lifeboat drills, and no time to ensure that every piece of life-saving equipment was functional. The scale of the operation dwarfed anything attempted before in European waters. Between January and May 1945, Operation Hannibal moved more than 2 million people across the Baltic Sea. On some days, over 40,000 refugees and soldiers were evacuated in a single 24-hour period. The evacuation was conducted in the depths of winter, with ice floes blocking harbors and freeze-and spray coating ship decks. Orders from naval headquarters made clear that speed was to take precedence over caution. Ships sailed with minimal escort, often without full crews, and with little regard for the dangers of mines, submarines, or overcrowding. Naval Command distributed responsibility across a patchwork of officers. Port captains, convoy commodores, and shipmasters all held partial authority, but the rush to load and depart blurred lines of accountability. Each officer understood the urgency, but few had the authority or the time to enforce safety limits. The result was a system optimized for maximum throughput, not for passenger safety or accurate record-keeping. This doctrine shaped every aspect of the evacuation, from the selection of ships to the chaotic scenes that unfolded on the docks. The Wilhelm Gustloff, reactivated from its role as a U-boat barracks, was just one vessel among hundreds. It would soon become the most tragic example of what happens when speed and numbers outrun every other consideration. Wilhelm Gustloff entered service in 1937 as a flagship for the Kraft durch Freude program, a floating symbol of leisure for working-class Germans. Its decks were designed for relaxation, with broad promenades, spacious dining halls, and recreation spaces such as a swimming pool and a cinema. The original passenger plan allowed for about 1,460 guests, each with assigned cabins and easy access to open air. Corridors were wide enough for peacetime strolls, not for the urgent movement of thousands. Stairwells and companionways, built to serve a fraction of the numbers later carried, connected the decks in a leisurely spiral rather than a direct high-capacity route. When war broke out, the ship's role shifted. Early in the conflict, it served as a hospital ship, then as a stationary barracks for U-boat trainees at Gotenhafen. By 1945, its white hull and red crosses had been replaced by naval gray, and its legal status changed. The Gustloff was now classified as a Kriegsmarine auxiliary. This reclassification meant the ship fell under military command, with the ship's master overseeing navigation, but reporting to naval authorities for operational orders. In practice, this status blurred the line between civilian and military use, opening the ship to both naval personnel and refugees, and subjecting it to the risks of a combat zone. Despite these changes, the ship's internal structure remained fundamentally that of a civilian liner. Lifeboats and rafts lined the upper decks, but their number and placement reflected the original peacetime capacity, not the realities of wartime loading. Below, the layout offered few options for mass evacuation. Large public rooms could be repurposed as sleeping quarters, but the bottlenecks remained: narrow staircases, limited exits, and few direct routes from the lower decks to the open air. In an emergency, thousands would be forced to compete for space along the same passageways, with little chance of orderly escape. As an auxiliary, the Gustloff was subject to different regulations than a passenger ship. Manifest safety drills and maintenance routines were handled under military protocols, which prioritized operational secrecy and speed over civilian standards. The ship's master, a merchant captain pressed into naval service, was responsible for the vessel's navigation and safety, but ultimate authority rested with the Kriegsmarine. This structure would soon be tested as the evacuation gathered pace, and the number of people boarding far exceeded anything the ship's designers had imagined. The consequences of this mismatch between design and use would become clear as the voyage unfolded. On the quays of Gotenhafen in late January 1945, the process of boarding the Wilhelm Gustloff collapsed into disorder. Port clerks, tasked with recording names and issuing tickets, were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of refugees. The initial system of lists, boarding passes, and assigned spaces broke down as thousands pushed forward, desperate to escape the advancing Soviet front. Lines dissolved into crowds. In the final hours before departure, efforts to verify identities or count heads gave way to urgency. Families surged up the gangways, wounded soldiers were carried by a stretcher, and naval personnel mixed with civilians in the chaos. Fragments of embarkation records survive, but they tell only part of the story. Lists compiled by the Gotenhafen Registry and later reconstructed by survivor historian Heinz Schoen account for 4,369 named refugees. These records exclude large groups, U-boat trainees, the ship's crew, wounded soldiers, and female naval auxiliaries. The official tally at sailing was 6,600 people, already beyond the ship's design limits. Yet even that figure was incomplete. Last-minute arrivals, such as the group transferred from the steamer Revel, were added with little paperwork. Some survivors recall that in the final rush, guards simply stepped aside, allowing the crowd to pour aboard until every available space, cabins, corridors, mess halls, and even the drained swimming pool was filled. No comprehensive passenger manifest was ever completed. Estimates for the total number aboard range from 8,000 to more than 10,000. The absence of a reliable list meant that after the sinking, no one could say with certainty who was missing, who had survived, or even how many had sailed. This data vacuum shaped every aspect of the disaster's aftermath. Rescue operations and later investigations struggled to account for the dead, the rescued, and the unaccounted for. The lack of documentation also masked the underlying reality. The ship's lifeboat and raft capacity had never been matched to the true number of people on board. The administrative breakdown at the port, driven by the pressure to evacuate as many as possible, left thousands exposed to risks that could not be measured or managed. In the end, the collapse of paperwork at Gotenhofen was not just a bureaucratic failure, it was a critical factor in the scale of the tragedy that followed. Lifeboats and rafts lined the upper decks of the Wilhelm Gustloff, but the numbers told their own story. In her final configuration, the ship carried enough lifeboats and rafts for roughly 5,000 people. That figure represented the best-case scenario: every boat serviceable, every davit working, every seat filled. Estimates for the actual number of people aboard that night ranged from 9,000 to more than 10,000. The arithmetic was stark. At least 4,000 to 5,000 people had no theoretical place in a lifeboat, even before anything went wrong. Life-saving capacity on paper did not match the human reality. The bosun teams responsible for launching the lifeboats faced conditions that made their task nearly impossible. Air temperatures hovered near -18 degrees Celsius. Ice built up on davits and lashings, freezing mechanical parts solid. Many boats were literally stuck to their cradles. When the torpedoes struck, one hit the crew quarters, killing many of the trained seamen who would have coordinated evacuation. Darkness and the sudden loss of power left the deck in confusion. As the ship began to list, the angle of the deck increased rapidly. Lifeboats on the high side dangled far above the water, while those on the low side were pinned against the hull or already submerged. Even where boats could be freed, the crowding on deck and the steep list made orderly loading impossible. Crew and passengers jammed the few accessible stairwells, fighting for space in the freezing wind. Some lifeboats were launched half-empty, others overloaded to the point of capsizing. On paper, the ship's life-saving appliances offered hope for thousands. In reality, only a fraction of the theoretical capacity could be used at all. The shortfall was not just a matter of numbers, it was a physical impossibility. The combination of overloading, frozen gear, and the loss of key crew members meant that, within minutes of the first torpedo hit, the prospect of full evacuation had vanished. The difference between design and reality left thousands with nowhere to go but the icy water. Within hours of leaving Gotenhofen, the Wilhelm Gustloff lost most of its escort, and the plan unraveled. The original convoy included 2 torpedo boats, T-36 and Low, alongside the large transport Hansa. Mechanical problems forced Hansa to turn back. Not long after, T-36 received orders to detach for another assignment, leaving only Low as the sole escort for a ship carrying thousands. The change was not an emergency at sea, but a routine high command decision. One more vessel reassigned to meet demands elsewhere, along the Baltic evacuation routes. The result was a smaller convoy footprint and greater exposure. As daylight faded, the Gustloff pressed onward, exposed in waters known for active submarine patrols. On the bridge, the question of which route to take became urgent. Captain Friedrich Petersen, with a background in merchant shipping, argued for a course closer to shore, believing shallow coastal waters offered some protection from submarines. He favored staying near the shore where maneuvering space was limited but perceived risk from deep water attack was lower. Korvettenkapitän Wilhelm Zahn, responsible for U-boat trainees, favored the prescribed swept channel farther offshore. Zahn drew on his experience and warned that submarines often lay in wait near predictable coastal tracks, and that the swept lane, though more exposed to sighting, was less likely to be mined. He emphasized the swept lane as a matter of naval safety. Official routing orders from Naval Command supported Zahn's approach, stressing the need to avoid uncharted minefields and congested inshore waters. The orders framed the decision as a choice between known submerged hazards and predictable enemy tactics. Ultimately, the bridge settled on the offshore route, steering the ship several miles from the Pomeranian coast. This decision placed the Gustloff in deep water, within the reach of Soviet submarines, but away from the densest traffic and the risk of collision with smaller unlit craft. The escort low struggled as temperatures dropped. Sonar equipment froze and anti-aircraft guns became inoperable, reducing the vessel's ability to detect or defend against threats beneath the surface. With only one escort and minimal active defenses, the Gustloff continued westward, a slow-moving target in the dark, frigid sea. The tactical debate on the bridge was never just about geography. It was a calculation of risks under pressure, with every option carrying its own dangers. Night had settled over the Baltic as Wilhelm Gustloff advanced westward, her decks crowded far beyond any intended limit. In the wheelhouse, the officers faced a dilemma that had no simple answer. The evacuation lanes were thick with traffic, freighters, minesweepers, and other refugee ships moving without lights through a sea mined by both sides. Standard practice in blackout conditions was to keep navigation lights off, especially with the threat of submarines in the area. But the risk of collision with friendly vessels, many running without signals or schedules, was real and immediate. A radio message arrived on the bridge. A group of German minesweepers was reportedly approaching on an intersecting course. The warning was vague, and in the darkness, it raised the specter of disaster. The officers debated their options. Kapitan zur See Friedrich Petersen, the ship's master, argued that some form of illumination was necessary to avoid a crash with Allied ships. Korvettenkapitän Wilhelm Zahn, responsible for the U-boat trainees, pressed for strict blackout, warning that any light would make the ship a target for enemy submarines. The discussion was tense, each officer weighing the dangers differently. Collision in blackout versus exposure to torpedoes if lit. Ultimately, the decision was made to activate the navigation lights. The order was relayed, and the Gustloff's masthead lights, side lights, and superstructure lamps flickered on. Against the snow-covered coast, the ship's silhouette became unmistakable. For a few moments, the lights cut through the winter gloom, signaling the ship's position to any vessel nearby, and unknowingly to any hostile eyes watching from the sea. Testimony from survivors and later accounts agree that the lights remained on as the ship continued west. The rationale was procedural, not reckless. In a congested, poorly mapped evacuation corridor with no reliable traffic control, the risk of running unlit seemed greater than the risk of being seen. The effect was unambiguous. Soviet submarine S-13, patrolling offshore, soon acquired a clear visual fix on the illuminated liner. The decision to switch on the lights, made in response to a radio warning and under pressure to avoid a different kind of catastrophe, removed the last barrier to detection. The ship now sailed fully visible in waters where stealth was the only real defense. Air temperatures dropped to minus 18 degrees Celsius as Wilhelm Gustloff moved west through the Baltic night. Ice formed on every exposed surface: rails, hatches, gun mounts, and lifeboat davits. Deck crews worked with axes and hammers, chipping away at the buildup, but the freezing spray returned faster than they could clear it. The ship's superstructure, never designed for Arctic conditions, became slick and treacherous underfoot. Boots left shallow imprints in the rime before the wind erased them. Mechanical systems suffered first. Sonar equipment on the lone escort, low froze solid, leaving the ship blind to any submerged threat. Anti-aircraft guns intended for defense against Soviet planes jammed as ice locked their breeches and traversing gears. Lifeboat davits, already under strain from age and lack of maintenance, iced over until their pivots and cables were fused in place. Crewmen tried to free the mechanisms with boiling water and torches, but the cold was relentless. In some cases, ropes and lashings froze so hard that knives and saws were useless. Cold crept below decks as well. Condensation turned to frost on bulkheads and inside companionways. Pumps and emergency generators, essential for any damage control role, became sluggish or unreliable. The ship's heating system struggled to keep up, and in crowded compartments, refugees huddled together under blankets, breath clouding in the air. These conditions shaped every aspect of the voyage. The hardware, meant to protect thousands, lifeboats, rafts, and rescue gear, became less and less accessible as the night wore on. On the bridge, officers understood that the ship's defenses were eroding hour by hour. The ice did not just threaten comfort or speed, it quietly stripped away the last technical margins for survival, leaving the ship exposed to any danger that might appear out of the darkness. The Soviet submarine Sestri patrolled the Baltic in January 1945 under the command of Captain Alexander Marinesko. For weeks, the submarine moved through ice-choked waters, searching for targets among the evacuation convoys. The mission focused on intercepting large transports carrying refugees and wounded, vessels that presented both opportunity and risk. On the night of January 30th, Marinesko's lookout spotted the silhouette of a large ship, brightly illuminated against the snowy coastline. Through the periscope, the vessel's size and profile left little doubt. This was a major transport, running with navigation lights on despite the threat of submarines. Marinesko kept S-13 at periscope depth, tracking the target from the seaward side for nearly 2 hours. The ship maintained a steady course, its lights making range and speed easy to judge. Marinesko maneuvered S-13 around the stern, choosing to attack from the port side, the shoreward flank where defenses would be less alert. The escort vessel Low remained on the opposite side, its sonar frozen and unable to detect the submarine's approach. At approximately 21:16, S-13's torpedo tubes were flooded and ready. Marinesko ordered a spread of 4 torpedoes, fired from a range of about 600 to 1,000 meters. 3 struck the port side in rapid succession. The first hit forward near the bow, the second amidships close to the drained swimming pool area, and the third in the engine room section. The 4th torpedo malfunctioned and did not detonate. Each impact sent shockwaves through the hull, rupturing compartments and setting off the chain reaction that would decide the fate of everyone aboard. Flooding moved quickly into lower spaces, and electrical systems failed as bulkheads were compromised. The attack was a textbook example of submarine tactics: visual detection, careful shadowing, and a firing solution made possible by the ship's visible lights and predictable course. In that moment, the procedural choices of the evacuation, route, lighting, and escort had converged into a single opportunity for S-13. The result was immediate and irreversible. The Wilhelm Gustloff, now fatally wounded, began to list as the consequences of those decisions played out below decks. 3 torpedoes struck the port side in rapid succession, each impact triggering a different kind of failure deep within the Wilhelm Gustloff's hull. The forward hit ruptured the crew quarters, killing many of the engineers and seamen who would have led damage control. The second exploded near the drained swimming pool where hundreds of women from the Naval Auxiliary had been quartered. The third hit the engine room, instantly flooding machinery spaces and knocking out the ship's main generators. Almost immediately, the loss of power plunged the interior into darkness. Emergency lighting failed. Electric pumps designed to slow flooding were silenced. Without power, communications between decks broke down, leaving crew and passengers to rely on shouted orders and blind instinct. The ship began to list to port, first at a few degrees, then rapidly increasing. Water surged through open corridors, flooding lower compartments and trapping those inside. Bulkhead doors, some triggered automatically by the shock, sealed off sections of the ship, cutting off escape routes for hundreds. Engineers in the lower passages had only minutes to respond. Some tried to reach the manual pump controls, but rising water and debris made access impossible. Stairwells and passageways, already crowded with people, became vertical shafts as the list worsened. On the port side, doors jammed and floors became walls. Those below deck lost any hope of reaching the upper levels as the ship heeled past 20, then 30 degrees. Within 10 minutes, internal routes from the lower quarters to the boat deck were blocked by water, wreckage, or the steep angle of the floors. The mechanical failures cascaded through the ship, pumps out, power gone, and structural passages impassable. Survivors later recalled the sudden transition from light to chaos. The spaces that had offered shelter now became traps. With each passing minute, the number of survivable spaces shrank. For thousands, the only remaining path led upward, to decks already jammed with people or out into the sub-zero water. In water just above freezing, the human body loses heat at a rate that makes survival a matter of minutes, not hours. For those forced overboard from the Wilhelm Gustloff, the timeline was grimly predictable. Cold shock set in almost immediately, causing gasping and disorientation. Within 10 to 15 minutes, most people lost the ability to swim or hold on to debris. Hypothermia followed quickly, and the unconsciousness often came in less than 20 minutes. Rescue craft, even when they arrived as fast as possible, faced a simple arithmetic problem. The torpedo boat Low and a handful of other vessels could each haul aboard only dozens at a time. With thousands in the water and a functional survival window measured in minutes, the mismatch was absolute. Estimates put the number of people on board between 9,000 and 10,000. Of these, only about 1,200 survived, making the death toll somewhere between 9,000 and 9,400. Among the dead were roughly 1,400 soldiers, U-boat trainees, naval auxiliaries, and wounded men, alongside thousands of civilians. The majority never had a chance to reach a lifeboat or rescue ship before losing consciousness. Even the sight of land, visible on the horizon, offered no real hope. No one could swim the 12 miles to shore in water this cold. Survival depended entirely on being pulled from the sea almost immediately. For most, the rescue system simply could not keep pace with the demands of the disaster. The numbers tell their own story. It was the deadliest sinking in maritime history, with the vast majority lost not to enemy fire, but to the physics of cold and the limits of rescue capacity. No system fails all at once. When urgency outruns caution, even the most basic safeguards vanish, leaving thousands at the mercy of decisions made far from danger. Today, evacuation protocols and maritime safety laws exist because of such disasters, but they are only as strong as the pressure we resist to cut corners. In moments of crisis, the invisible line between safety and tragedy is always thinner than it seems. Thank you for watching. Please share your thoughts below.